Hello. So, a couple weeks ago, I was talking with Venerable Kunga, and she mentioned a conversation she had with somebody who said they kind of like Buddhism, but they weren't convinced about the suffering being a problem or something like that. And and I've heard different variations of this. Really, people say, "Oh, I'm not suffering. My life's fine," or "The suffering's not so bad. Life has suffering and good things too, and it's all just part of the same beautiful thing. And and I was interested in Buddhism for a long time and didn't really have any guidance or direction on what to study and to gain a really clear Buddhist worldview. And so I've held this view. I'm like, what's the Buddha talking about? Sure, life has suffering, but there's joy. There's unhappiness, but there's difficulties, but there's a lot of pleasantries. And when I came across the translation that Venerable Chodron uses for the word dukkha as unsatisfactory, that was really helpful. I found that very helpful. I'm like, oh yeah, things are unsatisfactory. Samsara is unsatisfactory rather than just life is suffering. Made a lot more sense to me. And we look around us, we can see that there is suffering. There's gross suffering. There's the dukkha of suffering, where people are and beings are having a really hard time. People's houses are being bombed in some places. People live under regimes that come in and wipe out their village or something, or animals and being raised for food or in labs and stuff. Or we just have a difficult day and we see suffering. And when we have an unpleasant situation, we want it to end. And when we have an unpleasant situation, we want it to keep going. Unless it starts to become unpleasant, and then we want it to end. So we're back. And everybody in this room has studied enough and thought about enough about suffering to know what, the suffering of the dukkha of suffering and the dukkha of change, which is what that is. But then there's the dukkha of pervasive conditioning, where we have body and mind under the control of karma and afflictions. Geshe Potowo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Potowo. There's a quote from him that really describes this third kind of pervasive dukkha. He says, wherever we are born among the 6 types of beings, suffering will arise, such as sickness and death. When there is a cause for sickness, there will be sickness. When the cause of death appears, we will die. And these do not arise as some sort of unsuitable or accidental events. It is the very character or nature of cyclic existence. As long as we abide within cyclic existence, there is no escaping it. And this pervasive condition, this dukkha of pervasive conditioning, pervades all of samsara, and it contains all the other ways you can divide suffering. And I think the more we look at that, the more we might realize that unsatisfactoriness is suffering. I really appreciate the term unsatisfactoriness because it helped me to see things more clearly. And the more I look at this pervasive unsatisfactoriness, the more I realize that it's unsatisfactory because there is suffering. Sure, there's joy and such, but there is suffering. And the purpose of the Buddha's teachings are to eliminate suffering. And so we have to recognize this first. This is the first of the Noble Truths. And we have to recognize it in a way that is not superficial. It's easy to recognize the suffering of ouch. It's harder to recognize the suffering of change until you have some situation that you are enamored with and it ends. And it's like, oh, now all of a sudden I'm dropped off into the first suffering again, the suffering of ouch, But it's very hard to see pervasive suffering throughout our lives. And to realize that our aggregates are samsara. And samsara is this suffering, this dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness. And we really need to see that in order for, we have to look at it deeply and revisit this topic and refine our understanding of it in order for it to really affect our lives. When I was preparing for ordination, both when I prepared for the novice ordination and for full ordination, I did a lot of the Lamrim meditations on suffering, because ordination is about the determination for liberation, and you're not going to have that if you don't think you need liberated. What are we being liberated from but the dukkha? And so we have to really look at this in order to be able to get a strong determination for liberation. We call it renunciation. In my mind, I divide it into two things: this determination to be free and renouncing the things that get in the way of that. And renouncing unsatisfactoriness. Yesterday I was in the writing studio talking to Venerable Tarpa, and Venerable Chuni just walked by and handed me this. It's just random. It's a card. It shows a woman standing there, and it says, "It's samsara. People need help." And it's like it's an emergency. Do we see it that way? Do I see it that way? More than whether these other people that are saying, "Oh, suffering's not a problem," more than their response, I need to look at my own response in here. And I really looked at dukkha strongly enough to be able to have this strong determination for liberation. And actually what it says here, people need help. This is a big part of why I wanted to talk about suffering, because we talk about the Mahayana path, and unless we have a determination for liberation, unless we recognize our own dukkha and our own suffering and want to be free of it, we're not going to recognize others' suffering and want them to be free of it. We might see somebody is hungry and have enough compassion to want them to be free of that and do something about it, or somebody's ill and we want to help them alleviate that particular suffering. But that's not bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is more vast than that. When we have to really recognize samsara in order to want to remove that suffering for everybody, to lead everybody to full awakening. So recognizing suffering is the basis for compassion and for bodhicitta. Sometimes I look at these pictures from the tsunami. I think it was 2004. I look at them mostly to try to overcome attachment and such, but often, and it works great for that, but often I see each individual and I start to feel compassion. It's like I just see this person laying there, this body laying there, and it's somebody who didn't make it home, Somebody who had their whole life going on, whatever it was, and we all die. We all end up there. And it just came suddenly for that person. Or there's 200 something pictures, But the real reason I chose this topic is the thinking about seeing suffering in others and in ourselves too, but in our day-to-day encounters, when we encounter people, seeing their suffering, and especially when I'm having a difficulty with somebody, when I'm seeing somebody and I'm encountering somebody or dealing with somebody who is acting in a way I find difficult, maybe unkind, and recognizing that they're suffering. Because normally the mind wants to go to, they're causing me suffering, which is a misunderstanding of the second noble truth, which I'm not going to go into real deep right now. But I was in a discussion this weekend with some people, and we were talking about, training the mind to see someone else's suffering when they're acting out. This is something that came up. And somebody mentioned seeing a toddler, a friend's kid, maybe 2 or 3 year old, just throwing a tantrum, freaking out, And he said, oh, I saw the kid, afterwards when the situation was resolved, the kid was exhausted. And you could really see that affliction was suffering. And toddlers do act that way. They lack the tools. They have a situation, they lack the tools to deal with it. And so they just default. But it's pretty common for humans to not have, adults to not have the tools to deal with things. And they may have better skills at how to, what their default has become. But sometimes when we're not doing well, we go to bad behaviors, and it's suffering. And I found that a very good antidote to anger sometimes, to a few different afflictions, to recognize the suffering of others, to recognize, as Shantideva says, that these afflictions arise unwanted from causes and conditions. And for me, I think about how I know how that feels to be in that position myself. I've had afflictions arise, they arise. I'm under the power of afflictions, and when I'm overwhelmed by them, I know what that's like. And to be able to use seeing other people's suffering as a tool to not to condone negative behaviors. I don't even necessarily have to agree with their point of view, but just to see that they're suffering and to be able to turn my own mind away from judging them so much and to just say, this person's suffering. And I have found that sometimes that can keep my mind from going to an angry defensive response and instead to go to a compassionate place. And so that was really what brought up the idea of wanting to talk about suffering. And so suffering is really the basis of so much of understanding suffering, wanting to be free of suffering, and looking for its causes, realizing that it can be removed, and looking for a way to remove it. This is the Four Truths, and this is the basis of the path. And so I want to encourage people to do those meditations in the Lam Rim about the different types of suffering, and to look at suffering also in my own suffering, to look and recognize it, recognize the unsatisfactoriness of a lot of situations I'm in, of the unsatisfactoriness of samsara, and to feel that from one's own view. Like if we look at the dukkha of the different realms, like the hell realms and stuff, we need to look at that and think about how it would be for me to be experiencing that. But then there's also the suffering of others, and to see that beings are experiencing that right now. And so to really do those meditations in order to really have it hit home that we need this path the Buddha has given us. We are fortunate to have tools if we can learn to use them, and we need to course, we will get better with using them as time goes on. But and to really appreciate that the Buddha has taught us how to overcome this.